Hello, welcome to Z Marie Design. Let's upcycle men's ties into quilted art. Here's a list of supplies. So let's get started. So after selecting my ties, somewhere between 10 and 14 ties, I'm going to turn each on the back and I'm going to remove the tie tag on the back and I'm going to remove the tie tack on the back. And I'm using my seam ripper to do this, just making sure not to snag that fabric on the back of the tie. Now for this project, you don't have to remove any interfacing on the tie, so this is the only thing that you will be removing. So I'm going to hang on to these because I'll use these in another project. So I'll set those to the side. And now I'm going to just measure several of my ties just to get an average length. This will help me know how long to cut my quilt top, my quilt batting, and my backing fabric. So next I'm going to lay out about 12 ties that I want to use in my quilt, and I'm going to measure across just to get the width, and about 12 ties measures about 60 inches wide. So I'm going to cut my quilt top about 70 by 50, and I pieced my backing fabric with 6.5 inch squares, and I pieced it and it measures approximately 48 inches by 72 inches. Now you don't have to piece this, you can use just one whole cloth. And then for my batting fabric, I'm going to use this upcycled flannel that I have in my stash. You can also use batting. So I have my backing fabric, which is the piece, and then I have my batting, which would be the flannel. And now I'm going to create a quilt sandwich with my muslin on the top. And I'm just using a muslin fabric because that's what I have in my stash, but also I didn't want anything to clash with the ties. I want the ties to be the focal point. So I'm going to pin all three of these together and create a quilt sandwich. And then I'm going to take that to the machine. Now you can do free motion stitching on this, or you can use straight stitching or a decorative stitch. So I'm just going to do straight stitching approximately 3 inches apart. And it didn't even matter to me. I wasn't trying to be straight when I did these. I just wanted to create the quilt sandwich. I tried to mimic like a wavy line, like a dress flowing in the wind. So the next thing I did was to find the center of my quilt sandwich, and I'm going to take a t-shirt and I found the center of that, and I lay that down just so I can get an idea of what the bodice would look like. And I'm going to lay it down about 5 inches from the top, from the center. And I'm just going to take some chalk and trace around this t-shirt, again, just to get an idea of what the bodice would look like as I begin to build this dress out of these ties. I'm making sure to mark the shoulders, the waistline, and the neckline. Now you won't be able to see my chalk marks, so I did pin there so you'd be able to see where my shoulder seams are, where my waistline is. And so the first step to building this dress, as I lay out my ties in the order that I want to lay them out on my quilt top, I'm going to begin by crisscrossing, and at the crisscross is approximately where my waistline is going to lie as I begin to build this dress. So the next step is to lay another tie right next to that, and I'm going to begin weaving underneath that first tie, and then I'll lay out the next tie, and then I'm going to weave under and I'll weave over. So I'll begin creating the weave, but where the weave starts is, again, that's where my waistline mark is. And I'll just continue to alternate choosing the ties and again weaving over and under. And I'll just keep adding ties to make sure to just fill in and creating that dress pattern and creating the weave over and under. And I'm working toward the center of the bottom of what the dress would be. And as you're working toward the center and you're weaving up, you're also weaving up toward the shoulder. And you make sure that each of your ties, that they are close together. Now at this point you can have fusible web on the back of each of your ties and fuse these down. You can fuse these down with some basting glue. Make sure that your glue is dry before you take it to the sewing machine to sew these down. I'm just going to pin these in place. And just making sure that they lie flat. Now I did have one little spot there at the bottom that I need to fill in the center, so I'll add one more tie. And feel free to move these ties. You can spread them out as wide as you want toward the bottom. And it's almost like you're creating a circle skirt at the bottom. And again, I'm going to weave over under each of my ties that's already laid in place. And as you weave over and under, the big part is toward the bottom and the small part of the tie goes toward the top, and that's what's creating your shoulder seam. You'll see in just a minute as we go up. And the weave is at the waistline. So you can see now the shoulder seam where the small parts of the tie go up. And that V-neck is where our neckline is. So I want to fill in a little bit more so that my V-neck isn't extremely so low cut. And I'm going to at the same time be filling in the bottom part of the dress. So again, I'm weaving over, under. And you can lay down as many ties or as few ties as you like until you like the look. And you can see how it continues to fill out. And I'm going to do one last tie. This is going to make my ties uneven. I'll have 6 on one side and 7 on the other, but I really wanted to fill out the bottom part of the dress. And now I will pin these in place, but I make sure that all my ties are touching and there are no gaps in between where the white part of the quilt top is showing. So it's just an approximate number of how many ties you need, because you can have as few as 10, you can have as many as 16. It's just how full you want your quilt top to be. Now I'm going to pin these in place now that I like how it looks. Now as I began pinning these in place, I decided that I wanted to create at the neckline a sweetheart neckline. So I pinned the bottom part and I pinned the top part, but you see how I curved that neckline piece, and these ties are on the bias, so they curve very easily. So I curved each one to create that sweetheart neckline, and I pinned them in place. So now I will go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew a zigzag stitch. I started at the at where the waistline is, so at the weave, and then I started down to the bottom and I did a zigzag stitch, and increase your zigzag stitch width so that you catch both ties as you zigzag. And then on the outside of the quilt of the ties, I did a blanket stitch. But I sewed, and then after I sewed from the weave part down to the bottom, I left that part at the bottom. I left that loose. I like that look. I started at the weave part at the top, and then I zigzagged all the way up to the top. And you see these ties, since I didn't have them fused down, they began creeping up on me, which is fine. I didn't mind that uneven look at the shoulder seam. And now you can choose to cut these off, and you would just turn them under so you have a nice clean finish, but I chose not to. So my ties are all down, and now I'm going to put on my scrappy binding, and I sew my binding first to the front of the quilt, and then I turn it to the back of the quilt to sew it down. And I'll leave a link in the description on how to attach a binding to a quilt. And now that my binding is sewn on, I just did, when I turned it toward the back, I did a stitch in the ditch on the front of the binding. And you see my binding is a scrappy binding. I just wanted it to be scrappy just to help tie in the scrappy look of all the ties on the front and the scrappy look of my squares on the back. And now my art quilt is all done. And so next, to help define that waistline, I'm going to take another tie that I have, and I'm going to turn under one end. And this is just a scrap piece of tie, and I'll just have creating a belt. And I'm going to also put some rosettes that I made from some ties. I'll leave a link in the description of the YouTube videos that I saw this, how this ties were made. These rosettes were made from the ties. So I'm just auditioning the different colors that I might want to use. They all look extremely beautiful, and they really define this. But I decide that I'm going to use this flower that I made from the small parts of the tie, and I'll leave a link in the description on how that was made from the YouTube video that I saw. And I'll hand stitch the flower on, but I'll do a zigzag stitch to attach this piece of the tie for the belt, and then hand stitch that on, and then I'll be all done. So now that my belt and my flower are all attached, my Upcycled Men's Ties art quilt is all done, and I'll show you what it looks like hanging on the wall. And I think creating that sweetheart neckline just really makes it stand out even more. So I hope you like this project. I hope you really give it a try. I've seen lots of these on Pinterest, and I didn't find a pattern, so I just kind of created it the way I thought it should go, and I think it turned out really nicely. So thanks for watching.